Welcome to the Federal Bureaucracy. I'm Mr. Robin, taking you through an overview of the chapter notes for Chapter 12, the online text, or Chapter 13 in the hard copy textbook. What do you know about the federal bureaucracy? Hopefully you're able to answer these questions by the time we're done. What's the most common job in the bureaucracy? Who's actually included? How many people are there? And which branch does this actually become a part of? Where do teachers or firefighters or police officers, how about state and local governments, do they count? What is the perception most people have of the bureaucracy in terms of what they do and how they function? Well, we're going to take a look at some of those questions, and hopefully by the end you should be able to answer all of these in terms of the different aspects of the federal bureaucracy. We start with the course exam description for AP US Government and Politics, looking at 2.12, the idea of the bureaucracy. And this is part 1, where we look at 2.12 and 2.13. We'll look in part 2 at 2.14 and 15 in terms of the holding the bureaucracy accountable and public policy, and we'll take a look at those later. But in this video, let's talk about the idea of the bureaucracy, these agencies, regulators, corporations, and independent agencies, as well as the cabinet departments that make up the bureaucracy, the U.S. government that we know today. It is through the executive branch carrying out the laws or enforcing the laws. We'll look at an org chart here in a second. But all of the laws that are passed by Congress are for a purpose, and somebody needs to carry that out. And that's where all of these agencies and departments have come from. Over the 230 plus years that we have been a nation, the Congress has passed laws, and the president has signed those laws, those bills into law. And as a result of that, a bureaucratic government of agencies, departments, corporations, and regulators has been created in order to carry out these laws. And we'll see how they go about doing that. Now, this requires that in today's day and age, we have civil servants that are part of the civil service system. The Pendleton Act created this, which we'll talk about in a minute. But the idea here is these are people who are specialists in their field. They have degrees, many of them. They've worked in their respective industries for a long time. They may have a degree related to accounting, or they may be an attorney at law. They may have they may be a scientist. They may have other aspects of their jobs that they're carrying out here, being scientists or doctors, working at places like NIH, the National Institutes of Health. These are all career employees. Some of them are going through the revolving door, if you will, going from business to government and back to business, or to the corporate world, or to hospitals and different aspects of that. But many of them are bureaucrats. They're lifelong bureaucrats, career government employees. They've worked up through the hierarchy over the years, and as a result of that, they are very experts in their field, and so they have a lot of technical expertise. Sometimes you'll hear them not just called bureaucrats, but technocrats. Bureaucrat tends to have a negative perception today, so a lot of what you see is more of a technocrat, being a technologically astute bureaucrat, if you will, working in the civil service. And the idea here is this idea of bureaucracy comes from the word bureaucracy. Bureau meaning a French word for desk, sitting at the bureau. And then cracy is this idea of to rule. Now remember, this also comes from democracy. Demos, the people. Cracy, which is to rule. So democracy is the people rule. Here in this case, it's bureaucracy. The bureau rules. The desk is essentially ruling. And the desk being symbolic of the government bureaucracy, the government experts that work in the government in order to take those laws that are passed by Congress and turn them into rules and regulations that are then issued to the American people, and then that we have to follow. And they're going to enforce them. They're going to fine us if those aren't enforced. So this is where the bureaucracy comes from. Now, there's a couple of really good explainers. If you check the chapter notes, Crash Course has a couple here on episode 15 and 16. I think you'll find helpful in terms of that. We won't go into them here, but if you check the chapter notes or you do a YouTube search on them, you'll find them pretty easily on the bureaucracy and the different types of bureaucracies that are out there. I think you'll find those helpful. We're going to see a number of different political cartoons, but usually the bureaucracy gets a negative perception. Usually people are looking at the bureaucracy in a negative way, and a lot of that is because of the perception that has been passed down through the years. And Gallup has done surveys on this over 60 plus years in terms of what's the biggest threat facing our country. Is it big business, big labor, or big government, and big government wins every time because it is this beast. It is this giant, and President Trump used it in the campaign, right? Drain the swamp in 2016. It is this amorphous beast that no one knows and can relate to, but it is horrible in that it is corrupt, it is abusive, there's all kinds of fraud and corruption and waste going on within it. And no one can tame it, right? Which is why Drain the Swamp took hold to so many people, because it was so easy to latch onto, because everybody, I mean, look, 67% in 2016 really thought big government was the biggest threat facing our country. What they don't see is all of the things that go on behind the scenes to make things happen that we don't see on a daily basis. And so that is why the perception that is out there is very negative, even though a lot of what they do is very mundane, is very above board, is very legal, and is very specialized in terms of what they do. If you were to walk into a government agency, many of them, most of them, look like any other government office. Unless you're at NIH, which is very specialized, probably looks more like a hospital. You're looking at an office building that looks very much like any other office building you would walk into. There are professionals, again, that have degrees and are specialized in their fields. They may be lawyers, they may be accountants, they may be doctors or communication specialists, or whatever the case may be. They have taken a civil service exam. They have been labeled in terms of what GS level that they are a part of, and they're moving within that hierarchical structure. They have very specialized tasks, policies, and procedures in terms of how they are to carry things out, and they follow those in terms of using their discretionary authority based on policies and procedures. I can make these decisions. Oh, but these decisions I can't make. I have to move and ask someone higher up in authority within my department or agency in order to carry that out. So a lot of processes surrounding the bureaucracy in order to make it happen. Now, little b bureaucracy is what we're used to seeing, probably on the front lines. That's if you go to get your passport renewed, or if you go to buy a stamp or send a package at the postal service. You're seeing the little b bureaucracy in action. If you're going through customs at the airport, or you're going through security at the airport, we're seeing the little b bureaucracy in action. But what we don't see is a much broader, a capital B bureaucracy that is much broader and much more extensive in terms of how the government carries out the laws. And this is much more complex in terms of all of the different agencies, all of the different regulators, and the independent commissions and agencies that are out there in terms of carrying out the law. And that's in addition to the cabinet level departments that are out there in terms of meeting with the president on a regular basis. So let's look at the org chart. There's a lot here, but notice it all funnels up to the executive branch. It all funnels up to the President of the United States. And the president sets the agenda. The president is declaring what the priorities are and how to carry out those priorities in order to make the law, or in order to carry out the laws and enforce those laws. So Congress is making those laws, and then the executive branch's job is to carry them out or to enforce them. And they couldn't do that without the bureaucracy. They couldn't do that without these departments and agencies. Whether it's military readiness, the Department of Defense wants to send troops to a particular location. Again, the president signs off on that. Or whether it's the IRS holding people accountable for tax evasion, not paying their taxes on time, or trying to cheat on their taxes. It's the Internal Revenue Service through the executive branch that enforces those laws, as well as things like the Securities and Exchange Commission. If somebody tries to trade on information in the stock market that is insider information that the public doesn't have, who goes after those people? It's the Securities and Exchange Commission that's going to go after them and say, you illegally traded on information that not everybody had. That's illegal. As well as things like getting on an Amtrak train is a part of the bureaucracy. We pay for that service, but the government subsidizes that service as well. And even farmers out on the front lines of their fields, in the fields, harvesting soybeans, are talking to regulators within the Department of Agriculture in terms of what their crops look like and what they need out on the field, and what government help they may need in times of drought, and in times of subsidies like this trade war with China that's impacting farmers in places like Iowa. This is significant in terms of the role that the bureaucracy plays in terms of helping everyday Americans continue life as they know it, and things we don't even think about. And then you think beyond those things that we kind of take for granted, like going to mail a package at the Postal Service or getting on an Amtrak train. And then you think about things like the National Security Agency, where they're basically intercepting and preventing threats from becoming reality. And those are things we never hear about. So not only are they the mundane things we take for granted, then there are a lot of things out there that we don't even hear about, that we don't even know actually occur and transpire, and those are happening behind the scenes, and we're never going to know about those in a lot of cases unless something goes wrong. So that's really significant here. But the purpose of the org chart is really to show that the idea is that everything funnels up to the executive branch and ultimately to the President of the United States. Okay, so let's talk for a second about what bureaucrats actually do, because there's really three aspects of their jobs that are used to carry out the law or enforce the law here. The first one is implementation. How do we look at this in terms of implementing the law? How do we take this from Congress, signed by the president, and how do we actually carry this out? How do we actually implement it? And there's really two aspects to that. One is going to be that regulation that you see down there. How do we carry out this law? Are there rules and regulations that have to be basically formalized and created? Remember, the law is more grand. It's more pie in the sky. But these are bureaucrats. They have to get down in the weeds. They have to tell farmers, what is it exactly we want them to do? We're going to have to do some interpreting here about what the law actually says in terms of how to enforce it. How do we tell a farmer what they need to do so that they are able to comply with the law? That's part of the implementation process. They're also administering. I mentioned things like the Postal Service and delivering the mail, and Amtrak in delivering train service to various places across the country. But also things like the Social Security Administration sending out checks to beneficiaries, things that we don't even think about. Again, we take for granted, but that's all administered by the bureaucracy. These are all administrative functions that are actually taking place within the bureaucracy. And again, nobody's thinking through and saying, hey, we really have to do that. It's already functioning. It's been functioning for years, for decades, things like sending out those checks, and continues to do so as part of the administration aspect of the bureaucracy. And then the last one is regulated. So if there are rules and regulations and people don't comply with them, people don't follow the law, what do we do? Do we fine them? Do we arrest them? Do we tell them that we're going to sue them? We're going to arrest them? We're going to throw them in jail? What are we going to do? And so creating those rules and regulations in terms of step by step, these are the types of things you can do, these are the things you can't do. That is all what the bureaucracy does here. So the EPA is a great example of this. The idea of setting clean air standards. Now, in President Obama's administration, the priority was very high to raise the bar. So the Environmental Protection Agency really tried to address a lot more stricter standards around water and air and clean air. And so when the Trump administration came in, they said, our priority is not the same. We think that we're actually strangling business by doing this. Let's dial those back. So again, the president is setting the agenda, the president is setting the priorities, and he's dialing back those regulations. So again, when the Biden presidency comes in, President-elect Biden may look at that and say, hey, I want to bring back in some of those Obama-era regulations. I want to bring that back. So you can see the bureaucracy just in 3 administrations right there is kind of this pendulum swinging back and forth. And that's just on EPA regulations. Multiply that by all of the departments, the agencies, the institutions, the commissions, and the corporations that make up the bureaucracy. And you can see how a president and the president's policy agenda, the president's priorities, really do change very quickly how an agency looks at implementing the law. and carrying that out. And that's an important aspect because we really don't think a lot about that. We just take it for granted that it's actually going to happen. But it does take a lot of people on the ground in their respective areas to make that happen. So let's talk implementation for a second in terms of what is actually happening here. Now, implementation, this idea that you're taking the bill that Congress passed, that the president signed into law, and you're putting it into actual rules that you then will publish, and you'll get public comment on, which members of Congress can comment on, because this is the first time they're seeing the law actually be formulated into actual rules that society has to follow. And this includes businesses, this includes nonprofits, and this includes consumers. It includes everybody. So who does it impact? Who does it affect? And how do we communicate that in terms of this is the law you now have to follow? So the regulation aspect is very formalized in terms of trying to carry that out. But you also may need, in terms of enforcement, you may need people to help you in enforcing that law. If it's a speed limit law, you may need more cops on the streets in order to warn people that the speed limits have dropped. And you need to be more careful out there on the streets. If it is the TSA, the Transportation Security Agency, as you go through customs, as you go through the airport and you go through airport security, that's an aspect that, again, you need more people there. That requires spending. The customs example as well. You're going to need people that are working around the clock, by the way, because planes come in at all hours, and working around the clock to process people in terms of getting them into the country and welcoming them to the country, asking questions about where they've been and that kind of thing, and that takes people, and that takes money in order to pay those people in order to carry it out. So implementation is a very important aspect, but many times Congress passes a law and their vision is regulation, but they forget about the spending aspect. It's going to cost money in order to do this. So what does the implementation actually mean in terms of what the bureaucracy does? They're going to translate that law. They're going to turn it into a rulemaking type of packet. Think of it like a checklist of things that the businesses and government and individuals have to follow. How is it that we give them a playbook or a rules package of how to actually carry this out? They're going to assign an agency to do this. They're going to look at what this law was meant to do and then try and craft rules and regulations around it. They're going to assign resources to help in terms of issuing and getting feedback from the public about what's working and what isn't as it relates to this. And then they're going to put it out for public comment. They're going to get the feedback from the public about what is working here and what isn't. And they're going to adapt it based on what they're hearing from people. And additionally, then they're going to start to see this being put into action and the feedback that they're going to get from people, and they're going to adjust. Sometimes members of Congress get really upset because this wasn't what they intended at all. So they'll call for a hearing under a committee, and they will subpoena or ask particular heads of this agency to appear, and they will talk about all of the things that this agency is doing wrong and how they got the rulemaking process all wrong in terms of what the intent of the law was designed to do. And that aspect is really important because it really gives the agency a lot more guidance than the law actually did in terms of what is it that the Congress really wanted us to carry out here? What is it that they wanted us to do? And sometimes those laws are very vague. So implementing is kind of a guess in some cases in terms of how specific do they want us to be here? Well, we really don't know. We really have to get more feedback from them in order to do that. And there's no feedback mechanism that the bureaucracy says, hey, members of Congress, committees, we need your feedback on this. It's not that formalized of a structure. So it really is kind of trial and error in a lot of cases in terms of getting feedback from those committees in terms of carrying that out. Now, I will tell you, we'll talk a little bit about iron triangles, but an iron triangle is basically this relationship between the bureaucracy, members of of Congress, or members of the Congress members' staff, and interest groups. And this is a really important aspect when it comes to implementation, because a lot of times the bureaucracy needs feedback. They need to know what is it that the members of Congress are thinking, and reaching out to them and developing relationships with them to better understand how they want to carry this out is really helpful to bureaucrats. It's really helpful in terms of how they actually go about doing this, and that really is the key. Also, in that aspect, they rely on state and local governments to help them with this. The Department of Education does not give money directly to Montgomery County Public Schools. It gives money to the Maryland Department of Education, which then doles money out to all of the public school systems in the state of Maryland, which includes Montgomery County Public Schools. Okay, the Department of Transportation doesn't give to Montgomery County Highway Department money for their roads. They give money to the Maryland State Department of Transportation, which then doles out money to the different counties in terms of their highway programs to help improve their highways and that sort of thing. So this is federalism at work, because this is the idea of national, state, and local government working together, and really to carry out these laws and carry out these functions of government, they really do need federalism in order to make that happen. The national government doesn't have all of the people on the ground in these states in order to carry this out. So they may have bureaucrats that are there stationed in some of these urban centers and cities or in farming locales, but they don't necessarily have the depth and breadth that the State Department has, the State Department of that education or transportation does, or even the local public schools do, in order to carry out those laws. And so that's really where they are reliant on working together to make that happen. Okay, so let's take a look now at this idea of the federal bureaucracy, looking at, so how do we differentiate between some of these agencies? It's really simple to break this down, because there's really 4 divisions that we see here. And we're going to go step by step through each one, and hopefully this will make a lot more sense, because if you can categorize which agency we're talking about, it'll make a lot more sense in terms of, by looking at that agency, knowing a little bit about what they do or not, you can really categorize them in terms of, well, it is a cabinet position, is it an executive agency, is it a regulatory commission, or is it a corporation? So let's start by looking at the idea of cabinet departments here. Now, we have 15 of these. They are cabinet level, which means secretary of whoever is a part of the president's cabinet. The only one that doesn't have a secretary of that particular department would be Justice, and that is Attorney General. So the Attorney General is the head of the Department of Justice. All of the others are Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury, Secretary of Agriculture. You get the idea. These are cabinet level, so they must be approved by the Senate in terms of that top tier. And then they bring in some political appointees with them to head up the department, to head up the Department of Defense or the Department of the Interior. And so those are politically appointed positions. All of them can be hired or fired by the president at any time. They are at-will employees. So they are working on behalf of the president. They are carrying out the president's policy agenda, but they are political appointees. So they are not covered in terms of if the president wanted to fire them. The president could do that on Twitter. And we've seen some of that happen with the defense secretary, for instance, Mark Esper, that was fired right after the election. President Trump did that on Twitter. That's an example of a cabinet level position, and it is approved by the Senate, but the president has those political appointees and can fire them at any time, and he has. There are 15 of them, as I mentioned, and the longer list we'll take a look at next week. But let's look at the next category, which is independent executive agencies. Think of them, and this is really clued in here. They're independent, okay? Both the independent regulatory commissions and the independent executive agencies are very independent of the president, okay? And that's probably the easiest way to remember it. They are independent in that they really don't do a lot that impacts the president's policy agenda. Now, I know some of you, based on the election, you're looking at GSA, General Services Administration, going, wait a minute, Mr. Rodman, that had a pretty significant impact on the policy agenda because the president wouldn't concede to Joe Biden, and so the head of GSA also wouldn't approve the transition funds so that the transition could begin. But that is kind of a moot point now because that actually has happened, and the GSA has started that transition. But normal course of business, that is a rare exception that actually occurred. Most of the time, these agencies are very independent. They are working on their own. The National Science Foundation, for instance, is working on its own agenda. And occasionally the president will step in and say something. NASA is a good example, right? We want to go back to the moon. President Trump says we want to go to the moon. So NASA is working on its policy agenda to do a lot of things, but one of them may include work on a multi-year approach to get to the moon. They're very independent in that they're not involved in the president's day-to-day agenda. They may dovetail in terms of carrying out the president's agenda here and there, but for the most part, they're pretty independent in terms of the work that they do. OPM, for instance, is hiring members of the civil service. They're administering civil service exams. They are classifying people and interviewing people for security clearances within the government. All of this is done outside of the president's policy agenda. So the same thing with General Services Administration. They're overseeing the heat and the electric, and are the lights on, and is there heat in these offices in terms of where we are? With coronavirus, is it safe? Are there safeguards in place in terms of security? All of these things are in federal buildings. All of these things are done by the General Services Administration. And again, this is a function we don't even think about when you walk into a federal building. And not just up on Capitol Hill, but federal buildings wherever they are across the country. A federal building is being run and operated by the GSA, by the General Services Administration. So very critical here in terms of aspects that they can go and carry out, and very independent of the president. Now, regulatory commissions also very independent of the president. The president does appoint these positions, but the president can't fire these individuals just for any old reason. The president can only fire these individuals for cause. This is one category you have not seen President Trump try to fire someone. Okay, not yet. And so we saw with the Federal Reserve Board, he may not like Jerome Powell, the chair of the Fed, in terms of his aspects of monetary policy. In terms of trying to get the economy going. He may not like everything that Jerome Powell does, but he hasn't fired him because he knows that he can't just at will. He has to have a reason. There has to be cause. Otherwise, he can get his job back. And even though they're politically appointed, they can only be fired for cause. And the reason is because they're regulators. They're regulating what the industries are doing, and they have to have some level of independence in order to be able to do their jobs. Independent of politics, independent of the political machinations that are going on from year to year. So these are things like the FCC regulating the airwaves, what we see on television, on cable, on the internet, on radio. Federal Reserve Board, as I mentioned, the Fed, the Securities and Exchange Commission, in terms of traders, and are they trading on public information or not? And the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. Again, these are regulators. They're regulating, again, going back to that rulemaking process, they're regulating what's going on in industries and to consumers, and again, trying to protect consumers and businesses that are doing the right thing by making sure everybody's doing the right thing. And that's what's really important in these aspects. The last one then is government corporations. And this is the idea that they're charging for their services, but the government is also subsidizing their work. The Postal Service, we pay for a stamp, we pay to send a package, but it costs so much more to send that package and pay for those employees that are there, that it's the federal government that's picking up the tab for that. Amtrak, when you ride on the rails, you are paying for that ride, but we as the federal government, when we pay taxes, we are paying into subsidizing that Amtrak service. The Tennessee Valley Authority is also the same, providing electricity to those in Appalachia, in mountainous areas where there was no incentive during the Great Depression for electricity to be run to those places where there were many, many lives that were impacted by running electricity to those places. All of a sudden they had electricity. They had running water. They could improve their lives and their fortunes as a result of this. So government corporations are kind of quasi-independent businesses that are doing their own thing. They're corporations, but they're still owned by the government. They're still run by the government. So in terms of what we see there, they also operate pretty independently. But again, they are charging for part of their services, at least in terms of what they carry out. So if you see an agency or a department or a commission, look at it in terms of it is at a cabinet level. Does it have the word department of? That would tell you it's a cabinet department. Is it a pretty independent agency in that they kind of do their own thing, like NASA or the National Archives, which basically controls and keeps records of all of the documents that are created within the government? Is it a regulator? Maybe it's a regulatory commission. Or do they charge for their services? Are they a government corporation? So this is a really great way to break down the differences in these particular parts of the bureaucracy. Okay? The idea of regulation here is, again, this idea of rulemaking, of carrying out the law by making sure that business is doing what it's supposed to, and it's operating in a way that is the way that Congress intended when they passed those particular laws. If they're not, then they're going to be fined. They may even be shut down if it's a repeated offense. But they're going to regulate the industry in order to essentially keep the honest people honest and keep them doing what they should be doing. The EPA, as we mentioned already, in terms of fuel standards for automakers, we've seen this time and again, raising those standards to try and get them to encourage to protect the environment. Agriculture, you see a food handler here who's inspecting meat, and all of that being done above board. USDA certified isn't just a phrase. It is the U.S. Department of Agriculture that does this. They have inspectors that go into production plants where animals are processed in these environments, and they're inspecting to make sure that all of the regulations for their particular industry are being followed. And this goes even to as far as customs enforcement. How long do students stay on a visa? When does it expire? And how do we make sure that they don't overstay their visa? What do we do if they do? How do we regulate that? So we see this is an aspect of government bureaucracy that, again, most of us think meat safety, but we don't really think about all the people that are going in and inspecting the meat in these plants as part of this processing that we see there. Now, a lot of this happens, and we don't even think about it, right? The idea here is Congress has given the bureaucracy the power to create these rules and regulations, these guidelines, and then carry it out and basically create fines. And if Congress doesn't like it, Congress can call them in for hearings, can talk to them, can castigate them, but the idea is the same, that they are giving the bureaucracy, the executive branch, the power to carry out those laws. We see this time and again in a number of aspects. I'm not going to go into each one of these in detail, but these are some good aspects to take a look at, some slides related to the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission. We also see this with the Transportation Security Administration. All of these have websites. There's more information about rules and rulemaking in terms of what they do there, how they govern in terms of carrying out their aspects of the law. Now, just as you can imagine, when they come up with these rules, these regulations, and these aspects, we also have a lot of criticisms of bureaucracy. People say it's too large, it's too big. There's too much waste going on. There's too much fraud in terms of people abusing it, and of course there are aspects to that. But I would argue in business there are all kinds of aspects to that as well. And so how they carry that out may be something for news headlines, but there are a lot of people working in the bureaucracy that are doing their job day in and day out, and that are following the law in so doing. So accountability is definitely a problem. It is harder to fire workers in this capacity. It is harder to get them to follow, to get rid of them. But they are usually the the outliers. They are not the norm in terms of that. And there's a lot of pathologies we'll talk about later. This red tape, these unnecessary rules and regulations. It's too complicated. The bureaucracy has overcomplicated things now. And sometimes Congress will step in and say, wow, you guys went way overboard in terms of what we really intended by this law. You've really kind of gone over the edge. And then work with the bureaucracy to try and either amend the law or adjust the rulemaking in terms of getting it right. So it's not a perfect system, but it is a system where they are trying to get it right and trying to do that with the professionals that are working there. Okay, so this is looking at the aspects of the bureaucracy. We're going to go into 2.13 now, looking at rulemaking and that rulemaking authority in terms of discretionary authority. This idea of bureaucrats looking and making decisions based on policies, based on procedures, and how that impacts carrying out the law, which isn't always equitable, and it isn't always equal. But we definitely see some of that playing out. So policy making, again, Congress passes the laws, but they're not going to go into every minute detail of the law. They're relying on the bureaucracy to carry that out, to actually do the implementing, to hold the hearings and public comment in order to hear from the industry experts about what is good and what needs to be done and what doesn't need to be done in terms of this aspect. And then based on that, the government is going to make some decisions. The bureaucracy is going to make decisions about how do we take what Congress has given us and really put it into rules, really put it into regulations, a checklist, if you will, of things that need to be carried out. And they have discretionary authority to do this. The idea here is that they're executing with discretion. They are doing this in a way that is trying to carry out the full measure of the law, but to do it effectively in that it measures the intent of what Congress wanted them to do in the first place. So this discretionary authority, I always tell students, think about this in terms of a police officer, okay? Discretionary authority is the idea that when a police officer pulls you over, and they say, do you know what you were doing back there? Do you know how fast you were going? Whatever it is. They have discretionary authority based on procedures. They have to take a look at this situation, and they have some options, right? They can give you a warning. They can give you a ticket. If they deem it appropriate, they may even arrest you. And in some cases, as we've seen, they may even shoot you. How do you go from a situation in which they could be giving you a warning and walking away, all the way to the severity of pulling out their gun and shooting you? That's a pretty broad range of policies and procedures to have discretionary authority over. But that is a great example of how broad the discretionary authority is within the bureaucracy. Because Congress makes the laws, the president signs the bill into law, and then they give it to the agency or the department or the commission in order to carry that out. And it's really these experts in these particular agencies of the bureaucracy that really have to then look at this and decide, what is it that we do here? How do we actually make this happen? How do we put it into rules that people can understand and that people can be comfortable with in terms of carrying out? So when Congress signs this, the idea is then the bureaucracy has to create the rules and regulations around it. So they decide what works, what's acceptable, what's not, how do we address this, and what do we not include here, and then and hope that they get it right, because otherwise Congress is going to be breathing down their neck going, you went too far, this isn't what we intended of this bill at all. But again, going back to that iron triangle, the idea here is if they have a relationship with members of the committee or members of the staff of members of Congress that are on that committee, a lot of times they can get a good read as to what the Congress member intended by having those side conversations. And those power lunches, essentially, in terms of carrying that out. So it's a very important aspect of their job, and they really want to get it right. But if they don't, they know that the stakes are very high in terms of what's waiting for them if they don't carry that out. So a lot of rulemaking authority here, and then they're going to take it and then regulate it, right? So they're not only just going to write the rules, then they're going to put them into action, and they're going to actually do the enforcing. They're going to go out and actually enforce. They're going to do the inspections. They're going to be looking at putting cops on the street in order to enforce those speed limit regulations. They're going to be putting those inspectors into meat processing plants to make sure they're following the letter of the law. They're going to have inspectors and architects and other builders come in and inspect buildings to make sure that they are above board and following the rulemaking that was established by Congress. So there's a lot of those aspects that are really important here in terms of the authority that the bureaucracy has in terms of carrying out those laws. And this is important because, again, do they put the law itself into unconstitutional territory? They might. There might be concerns somewhere along the way that because they're enforcing the law in a certain way, because they've written the rules and regulations in a certain way, or they're enforcing it in a certain way, it may be deemed by the courts to be unconstitutional. That does happen from time to time. But the courts have their job to interpret the law. The bureaucracy has the job to implement that law according to the president's policy agenda, according to what the Congress tells them to do within the law, and then how they carry that out is really under their bailiwick. It's really under what they are designed to do. Now, in looking at this, they also act as courts in some cases because sometimes they have to issue fines. Well, what is the fine worth? Well, we're not putting someone in a court setting in order to issue that fine. We're issuing it as a bureaucrat, right? And sometimes many people say, well, that's beyond their power, right? That's going beyond what they were designed to do. That's really what the courts should be doing. Well, but if they're issuing rules and regulations, they also want to be consistent in terms of how they issue fines, how they issue some of those punishments along the way. And so many people say they have quasi-legislative or quasi-judicial powers in carrying this out by punishing those violators. And so many say, well, this wasn't your job. This wasn't your job to go into this depth. Well, the courts tend to side with bureaucrats in saying that bureaucrats have the right under the president's execution to basically create those rules. And unless the courts deem them unconstitutional or Congress comes back and passes a law saying or castigates them before a hearing saying this isn't what we intended at all, it's a lot of trial and error. And many times they get it right, and sometimes they get it wrong, and the courts step in and kind of change it and adjust based on that. But the idea is that they are serving as a judge and jury and a rulemaker as a part of this. But they're doing it based on the guidance they were given from the Congress, from the president, and definitely from the president's agenda in terms of carrying that out. One other aspect I want to talk about before we get away from this idea of the bureaucrats and who they are and what they do in terms of their authority. We have the creme de la creme of the bureaucracy, which is the SES, the Senior Executive Service. These are the people who are at the highest end of the civil service. They're at the top. Now remember, there's also a top tier above them, which is political appointees. But this is the top of the civil service. These are within the different departments. You can see here, this is the Department of the Air Force, and Veterans Affairs that have their own, they even have their own logo for SES. These are senior executives within the civil service of their particular departments. So they have worked there a long time. They've worked up the ranks through the years. They've worked up the hierarchy, if you will, and they are the experts within the civil service of their department or agency. They know how to get things done. They know how to move rulemaking very quickly for getting those aspects of the policy agenda completed and to do it quickly according to the president's wishes. They also know how to slow those types of rulemaking down in order to keep that from coming to light, especially if it's something that they want to move more slowly for various reasons, some of them political, some of them policy, and they want to make sure that they're doing the right thing. The SES are the experts in the field. They're the ones that when a bureaucrat, a lower level bureaucrat, has a question that they don't know how to answer, they move to up the hierarchy, and ultimately those are the decisions that are answered by the SES. They are the senior executives of the civil service in their respective departments. So they're the ones that are paid the best. They're also the ones that have been there the longest, and they're the ones that have the most on the job experience that can really address a lot of the issues. When something goes wrong or when they need further direction, that's really the people that they go to in order to problem solve in order to carry that out. So that's what we see. The top of the civil service is really the SES, the Senior Executive Service. Okay, so that's the aspects of the bureaucracy. In terms of some examples related to this idea of discretionary authority and some of the different departments and agencies within the bureaucracy, I've got some slides here that look at the EPA. The EPA is a great example of discretionary authority. They do go back and forth in terms of the president's policy agenda. I mentioned President Obama really raising the bar on EPA regulations. President Trump kind of dialing back those regulations in terms of the concerns about strangling business as a result of too much regulation. So again, that pendulum may be swinging back in the other direction, but the EPA is a good example of this. So how do they decide whether to issue a fine, close the business down, or arrest someone? A lot of that is discretionary authority in terms of how many times have they been told before that they needed to do something? How many times have they've been told that they're not following the law? And that discretionary authority is something that they are able to do on site based on policies and procedures that they have experienced and implemented along the way. Now, you can debate all day, and this is an aspect we would talk about in class in terms of is it okay that Congress gives that rulemaking authority to bureaucrats? Are there benefits? Are there challenges? And we'll talk more about that in class. But the idea here is the EPA does have a lot of discretionary authority, and the bureaucracy does as a whole. The police officer example that I mentioned, that's pretty broad in terms of the decision making that goes into that. And many police officers follow the letter of the law according to policies and procedures and do a really good job with it. And some don't, unfortunately. And so then we see aspects that have come up in things like the George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement, and other aspects where police officers haven't done a good job of exercising that discretionary authority. And then we have to figure out, as a society, how do we deal with that? And Congress looks to create legislation in order to address it. And, to be continued, we will see how that plays out in the upcoming, this new Congress that's coming in 2021. But the idea is there's a lot of discretionary authority in the bureaucracy, and we definitely see it in agencies like the Department of Homeland Security. How do they decide who gets kept at the border? And who gets placed into other types of holding patterns versus separated from their families? Who makes those decisions? Do they get sent back? Do they get sent to Mexico? What do we do with the people that are there? How are we making those decisions based on procedures, based on policies that are taking place? And all of those are decisions that are made by bureaucrats, that are made by people that are working on the ground in these particular agencies, in these particular locations. Department of Transportation, another one, in terms of how do they decide where the money goes to help fix highways and to provide better transportation systems across the country? Where does the money go? And how does that money get to the places that need it the most? How do they carry that out? It's bureaucrats that are addressing those types of issues. Department of Veterans Affairs, we've seen this in the headlines for a number of years, where some of the veterans hospitals are in horrible shape. And we've seen them in the last year or so really getting a better handle around that. But for years, this was devastating in terms of the news article, the news stories that you saw in the news and that you read about in the paper related to what veterans are going through, and who's making those decisions? Well, who's making those horrible decisions? And how can we fix that? It's government bureaucrats that need to address that. And again, we hear about the bad things And that's what gets publicized. That's what gets the negative perception. Oh, it's big governments that's the problem, right? But the success stories we don't hear about as much. We don't hear about them, and there are a lot more of those than there are of the others. But yet, what gets covered is the bad. Department of Education is no different in terms of how does the money get doled out to public school systems? How do they work with different states in terms of who gets what money? And how do we decide? It's government bureaucrats under the Department of Education that do this. The EPA we've already mentioned. The Federal Election Commission. How do they decide for election security purposes in order to carry out the law and make sure that people are fined if they don't abide by the law? How do we make that happen? It's government bureaucrats that are addressing that. The Securities and Exchange Commission. Again, if people are conducting insider trading, how do we go about finding them or arresting them and making sure that they stop doing it? And it sends a message to other people that they can't do it either. This is all through the bureaucracy, the bureaucrats within this agency, the technical expertise that they have in order to carry out the law in their particular aspects of the U.S. government. I hope you found this helpful. You can pause it here and answer some of these questions and taking a look at to just review this section. This ends 2.12 and 2.13 of the course exam description on the federal bureaucracy and discretionary authority and decision making. I will see you again in part 2 as we look at holding the bureaucracy accountable and what public policy aspects does the bureaucracy have. That's coming up in part 2 in the next video. But I hope you found this helpful. Good luck on the upcoming quiz, test, or exam.